We are following some breaking news right now that just came into the newsroom. Just moments ago, we have learned that parole was denied for convicted killer Benjamin Sifrit. So he is serving 38 years in prison in Hagerstown for the murders of Virginia couple Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley. He and his then wife Erika, both convicted in these murders. They killed Ford and Crutchley inside a condo in Ocean City,
Maryland. A place known for quiet harbors, crab feasts, and calm neighborhoods where life feels safe. But beneath that calm, this state hides something darker. Stories that twist through history like a shadow under the waterline. Tonight, we're opening the files of 10 women whose names still echo through Maryland's darkest courtrooms. They weren't strangers in the night. They were wives, mothers, daughters, and friends. Women who smiled across picket fences, handed out candy on Halloween, and walked their dogs past houses that will never forget what they did. Some killed out of rage, others for greed, and a few believed they were serving something holy while committing acts that can only be called hellish. These are stories of faces that once seemed familiar, and of the moment each one turned into something unrecognizable. Before we begin, tell me something. What time is it where you are right now? Are you watching this in the middle of the night? And what country are you watching from? Because as these stories unfold, you might feel Maryland's darkness reach a little further than you expected. From the crowded boardwalks of Ocean City to the quiet suburbs outside Bethesda, every case you'll hear tonight is real. Every name once walked among us, and each story will pull you deeper into the side of Maryland that tourism never shows. This is Top 10 Notorious Female Murderers in Maryland of All Time. Stay until the very end, because the last case, number 10, is so disturbing, it left even veteran investigators questioning everything they thought they knew about evil. 1. Erika Sifrit, Ocean City, Maryland. A summer paradise where the air smells like salt and suntan lotion, where laughter drifts from beach bars, and the boardwalk glows in neon every night. It's the kind of place where you go to forget your worries. But in the summer of 2002, 2 tourists came here to unwind and never made it home again. Their names were Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley, a couple out for a long weekend, just looking for a little sun and a few good memories. But what they didn't know was that another couple was watching them. Erika and Benjamin Sifrit, newlyweds, young, fit, and smiling, looked like the kind of people you'd meet over cocktails and instantly like. What no one realized was that beneath their matching smiles, they shared something far more sinister. That night, after meeting Joshua and Martha at a local bar, the Sifrits invited them back to their condo for drinks and laughter. Ocean City was alive that night, music thumping, people spilling into the streets. No one could have guessed that behind one door, 4 people walked in, but only 2 would ever walk out again. What happened next has haunted investigators for more than 2 decades. Something inside that condo went wrong, terribly wrong. There was no motive that made sense, no feud, no robbery, just a sudden, inexplicable eruption of violence. In the middle of that night, screams were heard. Neighbors thought it was partying, maybe a drunken argument. But behind those walls, Joshua and Martha were being attacked, cornered and slaughtered by the couple they thought were their friends. Police would later describe the scene as something out of a horror film. Chaos, destruction, and blood splatter that told a story no one wanted to believe. Benjamin was the muscle, a former Navy SEAL, strong and intimidating. But it was Erika who investigators say controlled the room. Calm, precise, commanding. Witnesses later said Benjamin followed her lead like a soldier taking orders. Whatever she told him to do, he did. And that night, she told him to kill. When it was over, Erika didn't panic. She didn't cry. Instead, she began cleaning up. Methodically, coldly. The Sifrits dismembered Joshua and Martha's bodies in their condo bathroom, using knives and trash bags to erase the evidence of what they'd done. They packed the remains into dumpsters scattered across Ocean City as if throwing away the weekend's leftovers. Then, unbelievably, they went back out, shopping, dining, and using their victims' credit cards. Surveillance footage showed Erika walking calmly through stores, flipping through racks of clothes, laughing with Benjamin. There was no sign of guilt, no sign of fear, only a chilling, almost playful detachment from what they'd just done. For days, no one suspected them. The missing persons reports for Joshua and Martha seemed routine at first. Maybe they'd gone off on a spontaneous trip. But when police stopped the Sifrits for a separate theft case, everything changed. Inside their Jeep, officers found a treasure trove of evidence: driver's licenses, credit cards, blood-stained items, all belonging to Joshua and Martha. That was the moment the mask cracked. The Sifrits were taken into custody, and the story they told would chill even veteran detectives. Benjamin tried to claim Erika was the mastermind, that she had manipulated him, whispered commands during the killings like some kind of twisted thrill seeker. Erika, on the other hand, blamed Benjamin, saying she was terrified of him. But the evidence painted a darker picture, one where both were willing participants. The prosecution described Erika as a puppet master, a woman who took pleasure in control, in chaos, in watching life slip away. They said she had a fascination with death and dominance, and Benjamin was her perfect partner in destruction. At trial, Erika sat silent, emotionless, staring ahead as jurors heard the details of what she'd done. When the verdict came, it was swift. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Benjamin received his own life sentence for his part in the killings. Today, Erika Sifrit sits behind bars, far from the ocean breeze that once carried her laughter down the boardwalk. She'll never see the waves again, never feel freedom, never walk those same streets where she and Benjamin hunted for victims. Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley came to Ocean City for a weekend of sun and peace. Instead, their lives were erased by a couple who found excitement not in love, but in killing. And somewhere in the rhythm of those waves, you can still feel the echo of that night. When paradise turned into a nightmare, and two smiles hid the faces of Maryland's most infamous thrill killers. To Patty Cannon. Before Maryland had electricity, before trains cut through its farmland and cities hummed with life, there was a woman whose name spread in whispers along the border, a woman mothers used to warn their children about. Her name was Patty Cannon. And by the time she was done, people would call her the wickedest woman in America. Her story begins in the early 1800s, when the land between Maryland and Delaware was wild and lawless. It was a place of crossroads and backroads, where travelers disappeared and questions went unanswered. That's where Patty built her empire, a quiet house on the edge of the Nanticoke River, surrounded by fields and silence. But beneath that quiet, she was running one of the most horrifying operations in early American history. Patty Cannon didn't kill for passion or revenge. She killed for profit. And she built her fortune on human suffering. She led a gang that specialized in kidnapping free black men, women, and children from northern states and selling them into slavery down south. She forged papers, created false identities, and when someone resisted, she didn't hesitate to make them vanish forever. Imagine the fear of living in that time, knowing that at any moment someone could knock on your door, drag you from your home, and you disappear into the darkness of the slave trade. Patty turned that fear into her business, and she did it with a smile. Her gang used hidden rooms, secret cellars, and iron chains. People were dragged into her farmhouse at night, their cries swallowed by the wind. Some were beaten until they couldn't move. Others were locked away until buyers arrived. And when her captives fought back, when they screamed or tried to escape, they simply stopped existing. For years, no one dared to confront her. The border between Maryland and Delaware gave her cover. Each side claimed the other's jurisdiction. And Patty knew how to use that confusion. She bribed, threatened, and manipulated her way out of every accusation. But time has a way of uncovering even the darkest secrets. It started small. Bones unearthed by a farmer's plow near her property. Then more remains. And then the discovery that would turn local whispers into national headlines. Multiple bodies buried around Patty's house, each one tied to her operation. When authorities finally searched her property, what they found was the stuff of nightmares. Skeletons chained together, small skulls, the size of children, shackles rusted into the ground. It was evidence of a decades-long reign of terror that had taken countless lives. The press at the time didn't know how to describe it. They called her a demon in human form. But those who had seen her said she didn't look like a monster. She looked like anyone else. A woman in her 50s, with gray hair tucked neatly under a bonnet, polite in public, respected even. That normalcy was part of what made her so terrifying. When Patty Cannon was finally arrested, she showed no fear, no remorse. In court, she sat quietly as witness after witness described the kidnappings, the beatings, the disappearances. Her house was called a tomb of secrets. And still she smiled. Historians say she was charged with multiple murders, though the true number of her victims will never be known. Before she could face execution, Patty died in her jail cell. Some say by suicide. Others believe her body simply gave out after years of carrying evil too heavy for any soul to bear. Even in death, she remained a legend of terror. Her skull was allegedly displayed for decades in a local museum, a grim reminder of what she had done and how far her cruelty reached. Parents told their children, "Be good, or Patty Cannon will get you." It wasn't just a saying. For years, it was a warning rooted in truth. Today, the town where she lived is quiet again. The fields have grown back. The house is gone. But the land still holds her story, buried deep beneath the soil she once ruled. Patty Cannon wasn't just a criminal. She was a system of evil wrapped in a woman's skin. She profited off suffering, erased lives, and vanished generations. And even now, 2 centuries later, her name still lingers like a curse along the Maryland-Delaware border. The wickedest woman America ever knew. 3. Brittany Norwood, Bethesda, Maryland. A town built on calm streets, polished storefronts, and the illusion that nothing bad ever happens there. It's the kind of place where people sip coffee before work, jog past boutique windows, and wave to their neighbors without ever thinking twice. That illusion shattered one night in March 2011. Inside a Lululemon store, of all places, a space filled with yoga mats, soft lighting, and the promise of peace. But behind those glass doors, a storm was brewing between 2 co-workers, Brittany Norwood and Jana Murray. They weren't enemies. They worked side by side, folding leggings, chatting with customers, sharing laughs during long shifts. But beneath that surface, something darker was festering. Jealousy, resentment, and a growing obsession with control. On March 11th, after closing, the 2 women stayed behind. What started as a normal evening ended with one of the most savage murders Maryland has ever seen. The argument began over a pair of stolen yoga pants, a small, almost ridiculous detail, but that accusation lit the fuse. Jana had confronted Brittany about shoplifting from the store. For a moment, there was silence. Then, everything changed. The details of what happened next are nearly impossible to comprehend. Surveillance from nearby cameras showed no one entering or leaving. No intruder. No masked stranger. Just 2 women. By the time it was over, one was dead, and the other would be found barely alive, tied up, bloodied, telling a story that sounded too twisted to be true. When police arrived the next morning, the scene looked like something from a horror film. Blood covered the floor from wall to wall, spattered across shelves and ceiling. The brutality was beyond anything investigators had ever seen inside a retail store. Jana Murray had been attacked with at least 8 different weapons: a wrench, a box cutter, a hammer, a rope, even a knife from the store's break room. She suffered more than 300 separate injuries. 300. The medical examiner could barely describe it without choking up. And the most disturbing part? Many of the wounds had been inflicted while she was still alive. Brittany Norwood told police she was a victim too. She said 2 masked men had broken in after closing, assaulted them both, and left her unconscious. She was found lying on the floor, wrists and ankles bound, clothes torn, bruises visible. For a moment, detectives believed her. It sounded like a robbery gone wrong. But then, little things began to unravel the story. There were no signs of forced entry, no missing money, and her bindings, they were tied in a way that allowed her to slip out of them easily. Her injuries were shallow, controlled, self-inflicted. When investigators searched the crime scene more carefully, they found something that changed everything. Brittany's bloody footprints tracked across the store, stepping calmly over Jana's body. Prints that started near the back room, moved across the floor, and then stopped, right next to the door where she'd claimed the attackers had escaped. The pattern proved she'd been walking freely after the murder. That discovery turned the entire case upside down. The supposed victim was the killer. Prosecutors later revealed that after Jana confronted her about theft, Brittany snapped. The confrontation bruised her pride, and rage took over. The first blow landed hard. Then another, and another. She grabbed anything within reach, turning every tool in the store into a weapon. The attack went on for minutes that must have felt like hours. Jana fought back, begged for her life, tried to crawl toward the exit. Brittany dragged her back each time. And when Jana finally stopped moving, Brittany didn't run. She staged the scene instead. She broke displays, smeared blood on the walls, cut herself just enough to make her story believable. Then she tied herself up, loosely, and waited to be found. When the truth came out, the community couldn't believe it. How could someone so outwardly normal, so calm and soft-spoken, commit something this savage? The courtroom was packed during her trial. Family, friends, co-workers, all listening as prosecutors described the methodical destruction of another human being inside a yoga store. They showed jurors photos, played audio of her interrogation, and walked them through the evidence. Brittany sat still, expressionless. Even when confronted with her own footprints in blood, she never shed a tear. The jury didn't deliberate long. In January 2012, Brittany Norwood was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge called the crime the most horrifying act of unrestrained violence he had ever seen. She was sentenced to life in prison. No possibility of parole. Today, Brittany Norwood wakes up behind concrete walls instead of yoga displays. The same hands that once folded shirts and smiled at customers are now marked by chains. And that Lululemon store in Bethesda? It reopened months later. Fresh paint, new floors, a different name. But those who worked there before say you can still feel something in the air. An echo of the night, when calm turned to chaos, and one woman's fury became legend in Maryland's long history of murder. 4. Zakieya Latrice Avery. In the quiet suburbs of Germantown, Maryland, the nights are usually peaceful. Rows of townhomes sit side by side, porch lights glowing like fireflies, neighbors exchanging polite smiles as they lock their doors. But in January 2014, one of those doors hid a nightmare that even the most seasoned detectives would struggle to describe. Inside that home lived Zakieya Latrice Avery, a 28-year-old mother of 4. To those who knew her, she seemed devoted, loving, and even protective. She posted photos of her children online, took them to church, and spoke openly about her faith. But somewhere along the way, that faith began to fracture, twisting into something unrecognizable. Zakieya had fallen under the influence of a woman named Monica Sanford, a friend who shared her obsession with spiritual warfare. Together, they became convinced that evil spirits were moving through their home, that demons had taken hold of their children. In their minds, this wasn't delusion. It was a holy mission. And soon, that belief would turn fatal. In the early hours of January 17, 2014, neighbors heard strange noises coming from Zakieya's house, chanting, crying, the sound of movement that didn't sound right. At first, no one called police. It was a cold night, and people assumed it was just kids or maybe a family argument. But by morning, flashing lights filled the street, and the truth began to unfold. When officers entered the home, the scene froze them in place. 2 small children, Nika, age 1, and Zira, age 2, were found lifeless, their tiny bodies wrapped in blankets. Nearby, 2 older children lay injured but alive. Zakieya and Monica were inside too, dazed, mumbling about casting out demons. What they told investigators sounded like madness, but they believed every word. They said they had seen the children's eyes change, that dark forces were trying to take their souls, and that God had chosen them to perform an exorcism. They described the killings not as murder, but as deliverance. Forensic teams documented everything. Toys scattered across the floor, religious symbols drawn in pen on the walls, Bibles open to random verses. The kind of scene that didn't just show violence, it showed the complete collapse of reality inside one woman's mind. At first, detectives thought they were dealing with drug use or mental breakdown, but psychiatric evaluations later revealed the depth of Zakieya's psychosis. She wasn't high, she wasn't drunk, she truly believed she was fighting demons that night. In her delusion, she thought she was saving her children's souls by taking their lives. The details of that night are unbearable. Prosecutors said Zakieya and Monica spent hours praying, whispering, and crying before the first attack. When it began, it was methodical, stabbing, smothering, pausing to pray again, then continuing. The 2 surviving children had tried to protect their siblings and were wounded in the process. When it was over, Zakieya covered the bodies and sat in silence, convinced she had done God's work. The next morning, police found her wandering outside, barefoot and incoherent. She told officers she had defeated the devil. When they asked where her children were, she said, "They're with the angels now." The case horrified Maryland, not just for its brutality, but for the questions it forced everyone to ask. How could faith twist into this? How does love become death? And what does justice mean when the killer's mind is lost in delusion? In court, the answer wasn't simple. Zakieya Avery was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. But after psychiatric evaluations, the court found her not criminally responsible due to severe mental illness. Monica Sanford received a similar finding. Both women were committed to psychiatric facilities rather than prisons, where they remain under constant care and supervision. Some called it mercy, others called it injustice. But everyone agreed on one thing. The system had never seen anything quite like the Germantown case. Today, that townhouse stands silent again. The families who live nearby rarely speak of what happened. But those who remember still drive past and feel a chill. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying evil doesn't come from hatred, greed, or revenge, Sometimes it comes from belief. Zakieya Latrice Avery believed she was saving her children from darkness. In the end, the darkness won. 5. Morgan Lane, Arnold, Howard County, Maryland. A quiet suburb where teenagers ride bikes past playgrounds and family dinners end with laughter echoing down the street. It's a place built on safety, predictability, and trust. But in 2013, one teenage girl shattered that illusion completely. Her name was Morgan Lane Arnold, just 14 years old. A freshman, barely old enough to drive. She had long hair, a soft voice, and a quiet presence that made her seem harmless. But behind her calm expression, something was growing. Resentment, anger, and an obsession with control that no one around her could see. Morgan lived with her father, Dennis Lane, a respected local businessman. He adored his daughter, and though they'd had their share of arguments, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. To the outside world, they were like any other family. But inside that house, Morgan was plotting something unthinkable. She had fallen for an older boy, Gavin Taylor, 17 at the time, and their relationship quickly spiraled into something toxic. Friends described it as obsessive, almost hypnotic. Morgan saw Gavin not as a boyfriend, but as a soldier in a war only she understood. And soon, she gave him a mission. In her journal, she began to map out a plan. Written in the cold, deliberate language of someone far beyond her years, she described how, when, and where her father would die. She even wrote about the feeling of power she expected to have once it was done. Every message, every note was proof that this wasn't a spontaneous act. It was design. On the night of May 10, 2013, while her father slept upstairs, Morgan texted Gavin and his friend Troy that it was time. Her words were short, simple, and terrifying. Go now. What followed was a crime that would haunt the entire community. Gavin and Troy crept into the Lane home through the basement window, armed with knives. Morgan waited in her room. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She waited for the sounds she knew were coming. When her father heard the intruders, he fought back. There was a struggle, shouting, movement, chaos. But the attackers overpowered him, stabbing him multiple times before fleeing into the night. By the time police arrived, Dennis Lane was gone. A father murdered in the home he'd built for his daughter. At first, investigators thought it was a break-in gone wrong. But the scene told a different story. Nothing was stolen. There was no sign of forced entry beyond that basement window. And then they found Morgan's text messages. They revealed everything. Her planning, her instructions, her cold detachment as the killing took place. She had orchestrated it all from her bedroom, knowing exactly what was happening downstairs. When detectives questioned her, Morgan tried to keep her composure. But the evidence spoke louder than she ever could. She broke down eventually, admitting that she'd been angry at her father, that she'd wanted him gone. Her reasoning made no sense. She talked about control, about wanting freedom, about proving something to her boyfriend, but underneath it all was one chilling truth. She had manipulated others into doing her killing for her. Prosecutors called her the teen mastermind, a child with the intellect of a strategist and the morality of a void. They read her journal entries in court, and the courtroom fell silent as they heard her words. Phrases like, "I'll finally be free, and he won't control me anymore," written not by a hardened criminal, but by a girl who hadn't yet turned 15. During the trial, Morgan's defense tried to argue that she was emotionally unstable, that she didn't truly grasp the permanence of death. But the messages told a different story, one of careful planning, deliberate coordination, and chilling calm before and after the act. In 2015, Morgan Arnold was convicted of first-degree murder conspiracy and solicitation to commit murder. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison. a sentence that ensured she would spend the rest of her youth behind bars. Gavin Taylor and his accomplice were both convicted of carrying out the attack. When the sentence was read, Morgan didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just stared ahead. The same blank look she'd worn in her mugshot, as if she already knew the outcome, as if she'd accepted the price of her plan long before it ever began. Today, she sits in a correctional facility, still serving that sentence. A young woman who once thought she could command death like a game of chess. Her father's home has long since been resold. The neighbors still remember the night sirens filled the street, and officers carried out a teenage girl in handcuffs. 14 years old, a pen, a phone, a plan, and a choice that ended a man's life and destroyed 3 more forever. Morgan Lane Arnold will one day walk free again, but she'll always carry the name the press gave her, the teen mastermind. 6. Bobbie Sue Hodge, Edgewood, Maryland. A patchwork of quiet neighborhoods and narrow roads where everyone seems to know everyone else. On a spring evening in 2019, the air was still, the kind of calm that comes before the scent of rain. Within hours, that calm would ignite into a wall of flame that devoured a home, 4 lives, and any illusion of safety the town had left. At the center of it all was Bobbie Sue Hodge, a woman in her early 40s who carried grudges like kindling. Friends said she had a temper that burned quick and bright, that arguments with her always ended in smoke. But no one could have imagined how literal that would become. The house on Sims Road belonged to people Bobbie once called friends. There had been a fight over money, over betrayal, over something so small it should have been forgettable. But anger has a way of growing when it's fed by pride. In Bobbie's mind, someone had to pay. And on that night in April 2019, she decided fire would do the talking. Investigators later pieced together her movements like scenes in a tragic film. She bought accelerant at a nearby station, drove to the townhouse just after midnight, and crept across the lawn with the quiet focus of someone convinced she was justified. Then, she poured the liquid through the doorway and struck a flame. What happened next lasted only minutes, but it felt like the end of the world. The fire spread so fast that neighbors thought they were hearing explosions. Windows burst outward, sending glass into the night air. Inside, 4 people, including 2 children, were trapped upstairs. Their screams were swallowed by the roar of fire as the entire structure collapsed in on itself. By the time firefighters arrived, the building was an inferno. They couldn't reach anyone. They couldn't even get close. When daylight came, Edgewood looked like a war zone. Charred beams jutted out of the ash like broken bones. The smell of gasoline still hung heavy. Among the rubble, investigators found clear evidence that the fire hadn't started by accident. Patterns on the floor showed where the accelerant had been poured. And near the debris, security footage from a neighbor's camera caught the silhouette of a woman walking away from the scene, carrying a gas can. Detectives traced that image back to Bobbie Sue Hodge within 48 hours. When they brought her in for questioning, she didn't deny being there. At first, she said she only wanted to scare them, to teach them a lesson. But the calmness in her voice when she described the fire sent chills through the room. It wasn't remorse, it was satisfaction. Forensic teams matched her fingerprints to the can found near the wreckage. Chemical analysis confirmed the accelerant was identical to the one purchased on her debit card earlier that night. Every detail tied back to her. And she knew it. At her 2025 trial, prosecutors walked the jury through the final minutes inside the house. They described how fast the flames climbed the staircase, how the smoke turned deadly before the victims ever had a chance to escape. Each detail painted Bobbie as a woman who wanted more than revenge. She wanted to erase. Witnesses told the court about her rage, the threats she'd made in the days before the fire, and the chilling words she'd once said to a friend, "If I can't have peace, nobody will." The jury took less than 2 hours to return their verdict. Guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of arson. When the judge read the sentence, 180 years in prison, Bobbie stood silent, her face unreadable. No apology, no tears. Just a woman staring at the floor, while families in the courtroom wept for what she had taken. Today, Bobbie Sue Hodge sits in a Maryland prison where she will grow old behind concrete and steel. She will never again feel the warmth of a match or the rush of power she found in destruction. And every spring, when the wind shifts just right in Edgewood, some say you can still smell the faint trace of smoke, a reminder of the night one woman's fury turned an entire home to ash. 7. Renee Denise Bowman, Bowie, Maryland. A quiet neighborhood of tidy lawns and cul-de-sacs where life moves at an easy pace. It's the kind of place where people wave to each other from driveways and assume the worst thing hiding behind a door is an unwalked dog. But in September of 2008, one house on Cherrywood Lane hid something that would shock the nation. Inside that house lived Renee Denise Bowman, a woman who had presented herself as a model parent. She was a single mother who had adopted 3 little girls through the foster care system. 3 children who had already known loss and were supposed to be safe at last. She told neighbors she was strict but loving, that she kept the girls close because she didn't trust the world. No one guessed what was really happening inside those walls. One humid night, a 9-year-old girl ran barefoot into the street. She was bruised, terrified, clutching nothing but a thin blanket. When police found her, she could barely speak through her tears. All she managed to say was, "My mommy keeps my sisters in the freezer." Officers thought she was hallucinating from fear. Then they went to the house. The moment they opened the freezer in the basement, time seemed to stop. Inside were the frozen bodies of 2 little girls, preserved like evidence of a secret Renee had been hiding for years. Investigators later confirmed they were her adopted daughters, dead for months, maybe longer. Their names were Jasmine and Tasha. They had died in that same house while their surviving sister lived above them, unaware that the humming appliance in the corner held her family. Renee told police a story that made even seasoned detectives turn away. She said she disciplined the girls that they'd been too much to handle. When one died, she panicked. When the second followed, she simply made room in the freezer. Her words were flat, without emotion, as though she were describing food gone bad. Forensic teams uncovered years of abuse. The surviving child had scars from belts, extension cords, and burns. Social workers discovered that Renee had continued collecting government subsidy checks for all 3 girls long after 2 were dead. She was cashing in the system meant to save them. During her trial, prosecutors laid out the pattern of cruelty in painstaking detail: the starvation, the beatings, the confinement. They showed photos of the small freezer, the household items she'd used as weapons, the records proving she'd lied to adoption agencies again and again. When the verdict came, there was no question. Renee Denise Bowman was convicted of first-degree murder and child abuse, resulting in death. She received 2 life sentences with an additional 40-year term. The case ignited outrage far beyond Maryland. How had this woman passed background checks? How had no one visited the home in years? Legislators cited her name when they rewrote state foster care regulations. Reporters called her the Freezer Mother, a title that chilled every headline it appeared in. Today, Renee sits in a Maryland correctional institution, serving out the rest of her days. The surviving daughter, now an adult, lives under a new name, far from the house that stole her childhood. The Bowie home has long since been sold, its freezer replaced, its walls repainted. But neighbors still remember that night. The sirens, the floodlights, the officers carrying out the cold remains of innocence. And every time the air hums with the sound of an old freezer starting up, they remember the woman who froze her secrets and the little girls who will never grow up. 8 Josephine, Virginia. Gray, Montgomery County, Maryland. A quiet suburban stretch where cul-de-sacs meet winding back roads, and life seems almost predictable. But behind one ordinary front door lived a woman who could turn love into a weapon, and every relationship into a death sentence. Her name was Josephine Virginia Gray, and for decades, she moved through life like a spider, patient, deliberate, and deadly. In the late 1970s, Josephine was known as charming, graceful, and persuasive. She had a smile that could melt tension in a room and a way of making people trust her instantly. But what no one realized was that every time she fell in love, someone was destined to die. Her story wasn't about rage or revenge. It was about money and how far she was willing to go to get it. Her first husband, Norman Stribling, died in 1974. It was a shock to everyone who knew them. Norman had been young, healthy, and devoted to her. When his body was found with gunshot wounds, police asked questions. Josephine played the grieving widow perfectly. Tears, heartbreak, trembling hands. The case went nowhere. Within months, she collected his life insurance payout and moved on. By the early 1990s, she was living with another man, William Gray. Friends thought she had finally found peace, but history was about to repeat itself. William began noticing strange things, missing checks, credit cards opened in his name, small lies that didn't add up. When he confronted her, neighbors heard shouting, doors slamming, threats. And then, William vanished. Days later, his body was found in his car, shot multiple times. Once again, Josephine appeared before detectives in tears. Once again, she said she had no idea who could have done such a thing. And once again, she collected thousands from insurance policies tied to his death. But this time, detectives didn't let it go. They started digging through her past, bank accounts, old police files, insurance records. What they found tied her to a chilling pattern stretching back over 20 years. 2 husbands dead, 1 lover gone, under suspicious circumstances. And in every case, Josephine had been the sole beneficiary of their insurance money. By the late 1990s, whispers of the Black Widow spread across Maryland. Even among law enforcement, her name carried a shiver. They knew she was dangerous, but she was also clever. She covered her tracks with precision, moving money through fake accounts and convincing others to lie for her. Then, investigators caught a break. A woman came forward terrified, claiming Josephine had confessed everything during an argument. She told police about the nights Josephine bragged that no one could touch her, that she'd be rich while everyone else rots. That confession set the final trap. Federal agents, working with state prosecutors, hit her from another angle. Fraud and conspiracy charges linked to the insurance payouts. Once they proved she had profited from murder, the rest of the case began to unravel. Friends who once defended her began to talk. Neighbors recalled screams. Relatives told stories about her temper, her threats, and her coldness. When Josephine finally went to trial, the courtroom was packed. The jurors listened as prosecutors painted a portrait of a woman who seduced, controlled, and killed for profit. They called her Maryland's own Black Widow, a woman who spun lies as easily as silk and left only bodies in her wake. Evidence showed she had personally filed the insurance claims after each death, changing signatures and forging paperwork. Investigators testified about phone calls she made to check on policy details before the killings. Every thread pointed back to her. In 2002, Josephine Virginia Gray was convicted on federal fraud and perjury charges tied to the murders. Although she was never convicted of murder directly, prosecutors made one thing clear in court. Without her, none of those men would have died. The judge sentenced her to decades in federal prison, calling her a predator cloaked in charm. Today, she serves her time in a federal correctional facility, her once carefully constructed life stripped away. The money, the homes, the web of lies, all gone. Only her name remains echoing through Maryland's criminal history as the woman who married for money and left death behind every time she said, "I do." Neighbors who lived near her still tell stories. They remember her porch light glowing late at night, the way she waved with that same pleasant smile, and how no one guessed what she was capable of. She didn't kill in fits of rage. She killed quietly, efficiently, like a true black widow. 9. Kimberly Michelle Hricko, Cambridge, Maryland, a sleepy town that sits on the edge of the Chesapeake Bay, where the air smells like salt and marsh, and weekends are spent by the water. But in February of 1998, the quiet of the Hyatt Regency Resort on the river was shattered by a fire that seemed at first like a tragic accident, a husband dead, a wife hysterical, a hotel room reduced to smoke and ash. But the truth hiding inside that room was darker than anyone imagined. Because that wife was Kimberly Michelle Hricko, and the fire wasn't an accident. It was part of her plan. Kimberly and her husband, Stephen Hricko, had been attending a Valentine's Day murder mystery weekend at the resort, a themed event where guests played along with actors to solve a fictional crime. It was supposed to be lighthearted, romantic, a break from their rocky marriage. But for Kimberly, it was the perfect cover, a weekend surrounded by staged death, where one real murder might look like just another part of the show. That night, guests were laughing, wine glasses clinking, and music echoing from the ballroom. But upstairs in room 306, Stephen Hricko was dying. Investigators later determined that before she set the fire, Kimberly poisoned him, slipping a chemical compound called succinylcholine into his wine. It's a paralyzing agent, one that stops the muscles from moving, including the ones needed to breathe. He couldn't call for help, couldn't move, couldn't even scream. Then, while her husband lay helpless, Kimberly set the room ablaze. Flames crawled up the curtains, devoured the bedspread, and filled the air with thick, black smoke. The fire spread fast, triggered the alarms, and sent guests rushing into the halls in confusion and fear. By the time firefighters broke down the door, Stephen was gone. At first, investigators assumed it was a tragic accident. Maybe a cigarette left burning. Maybe a candle forgotten. Kimberly cried on cue. She told them she had been downstairs, that she'd come back to find the room in flames. She played the grieving widow flawlessly, but the performance didn't last. Fire marshals quickly realized the burn pattern was wrong. The flames had started low, near the floor, consistent with an accelerant, not a candle. And when the medical examiner ran toxicology tests on Stephen's blood, the results told a story Kimberly couldn't explain. There it was, succinylcholine, a hospital-grade drug, not available to the public. Investigators learned that Kimberly worked in a medical setting and had access to restricted chemicals. They found out she'd been researching fire damage and insurance policies in the weeks before the trip, and they discovered her motive. Stephen had been planning to leave her. Divorce meant losing everything she wanted to keep: money, property, and control. When confronted, Kimberly didn't confess. She doubled down. She insisted her husband had been depressed, that maybe he'd started the fire himself. But the evidence crushed her story. Detectives found traces of accelerant on her clothing. Surveillance footage showed her entering the hotel elevator alone, minutes before the fire started, calm and composed. At trial, prosecutors presented her plan as a chilling fusion of poison and fire. 2 methods, 1 intent. They showed how she'd paralyzed her husband before lighting the match, ensuring he would die without a sound. They described how she had used the chaos of the murder mystery weekend as camouflage for a real murder. The jury didn't take long. In 2001, Kimberly Hricko was convicted of first-degree murder and arson. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. The judge called her crime a performance staged with death as the script and greed as the motive. Today, Kimberly sits in a Maryland correctional facility, serving out her sentence with no chance of parole. She maintains her innocence, claiming even now that her husband's death was a tragic misunderstanding. But the facts remain burned into the state's history. The chemical traces, the fire pattern, the timeline. Hotel guests who were there that night say they still remember the smell. Smoke mixed with something chemical, acrid, unforgettable. They remember seeing her standing outside as firefighters worked, her face blank, her hands shaking just enough to look believable. The irony never faded. A woman who came to play a weekend game of pretend murder ended up committing a real one. She poisoned her husband's last glass of wine, lit his final room on fire, and thought she'd written the perfect ending. But the flames told the truth. And in the ashes of that hotel room, Maryland found one of its most chilling love stories gone to hell, the tale of the fire and poison wife. 10. Leaundra Kim Matthews, Montgomery County, Maryland. A place of family homes and familiar faces where siblings grow up side by side, sharing secrets, fights, and laughter. But in 2017, one family's bond twisted into something unrecognizable, a conspiracy born not out of love, but out of hatred. And at the center of it stood Leaundra Kim Matthews, a twin who helped orchestrate the murder of her own brother. Leaundra and her twin sister Lime had always been close. They shared everything. Birthdays, friends, even grudges. But in their early 20s, their relationship with their younger brother Christian Matthews began to fall apart. Family members said the tension started with arguments over respect, over who got what, over who listened and who didn't. Small conflicts that most families let fade, except this one didn't. In the Matthews home, resentment built until it turned toxic. The twins convinced themselves that Christian had disrespected them. And in their minds, that was enough to justify anything. They didn't argue it out. They didn't distance themselves. They planned his death. Over weeks, Leaundra, Lime, and Leaundra's boyfriend, Dante McCrae, exchanged messages about how and when to do it. They plotted every step. What time he'd be home, what words they'd use to lure him in, how they'd make it look like a robbery. The text messages later read like a script, lines of deception written by people who had already crossed the point of no return. On a cold night in February 2017, the plan became reality. Christian came home, unaware that his sisters were waiting for him. They greeted him like nothing was wrong. Maybe they smiled. Maybe they even laughed. But as soon as the door closed, the air turned heavy. It started as an argument. Sharp words, raised voices, the kind of family shouting that neighbors usually ignore. But this wasn't an ordinary fight. When Christian tried to walk away, they grabbed him. The struggle moved through the living room, furniture crashing, objects scattering. And then it turned silent. Police would later find that Christian had been strangled to death, his final moments spent fighting against the same hands that had once held his as a child. The people he trusted most had taken his life in their own home. After the killing, Leaundra and her sister didn't call for help. They didn't grieve. They began to cover it up. They moved his body, wiped surfaces, created a story that made no sense, but was just convincing enough to buy them a few hours. They thought they could erase blood, erase guilt, and erase what they'd done. But the truth was already spreading. When detectives questioned them, the cracks appeared fast. Their timelines didn't match. Their emotions didn't fit. And when police retrieved their phones, the messages told the whole story. The planning, the agreement, the shared responsibility. Every line of text was another nail in their coffin. In court, prosecutors called the case an unthinkable betrayal. They described how two sisters, identical in every way, had mirrored each other's cruelty until it became impossible to tell which one had led and which one had followed. They said Leaundra had been the planner, the one who gave direction, who pushed the plan forward, who convinced the others to follow through. Witnesses testified about the family's collapse, about how jealousy and control had replaced love. The defense tried to argue that Leaundra had been manipulated by her twin, that she'd gone along out of loyalty and fear. But the evidence, her own words, said otherwise. In 2023, Leaundra Kim Matthews was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Her sister and boyfriend received similar terms. None of them spoke at sentencing. They stood in silence as the judge called their crime one of the coldest acts of familial betrayal the court had ever seen. Today, Leaundra and Lime served their sentences separately. The bond that once defined them shattered forever. Two twins, divided by walls and decades, each left to remember the brother they conspired to kill. The Matthews home was sold, repainted, and reclaimed by another family. But those who remember that winter night say the story never really left. They still talk about the twins who turned on their own blood, and the brother who never saw it coming. Family is supposed to be the one place you're safe, but for Christian Matthews, it was the place where trust ended, and where betrayal wore the face of his own twin. Leaundra Kim Matthews will one day walk free, but no sentence, no number of years, will ever erase the name that Marilyn gave her, the twin conspiracy killer. And there it is, 10 women, 10 stories that feel impossible to believe, yet every detail is real. Each one of them walked the same streets we do. They smiled, they worked, they loved, and somewhere along the line, something inside them broke. From Ocean City's boardwalks to Bowie's quiet suburbs, Maryland has carried the weight of their crimes for decades. Behind each case is a question we can never quite answer. What turns an ordinary life into a story this dark? Was it greed? Was it rage? Was it something far more complicated? A moment that snapped the line between humanity and horror? If you've watched this far, I want to know what you think. Which case hit you the hardest? Which one made you pause the video just to take a breath? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one. And tell me this. What time is it where you're watching from right now? Is it late at night, lights off, screen glowing in the dark? Or are you watching in the middle of the day somewhere across the world where the sun is still up? Let me know what country you're in. It always amazes me how these stories travel so far. If you want more deep dives like this, the real stories, the ones that hide behind headlines, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Share this video with someone who loves true crime as much as you do, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next story when it drops. These aren't just tales about murder. They're mirrors reflecting what we're capable of when fear, obsession, or desperation take control. Maybe that's why we keep coming back to them. Not because we enjoy the darkness, but because we're trying to understand it. So as this story fades and the screen goes dark, take one last thought with you. Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a smile. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.